sigh, he approached the tree and ducked around it to find Eddie and his new camera. "What are you doing, Eddie?" Eddie forced a smile. "Just walking. What about you?" Vlad knew he was lying. They both knew it. He shook his head, weary of Eddie's antics already. "Nothing. That's all I'm doing, Eddie. And that's all you'll ever catch me doing by following me. So why don't you get another hobby?" He turned across the street. As his foot touched pavement, he heard the click of a camera behind him. The sound made the corner of his mouth twitch in irritation. By the time Vlad got back to the house, he was completely annoyed with Eddie, but overshadowing his annoyance was the fact that he dreaded the conversation that he knew was waiting for him there. He slipped through the front gate as quietly as he could, moved up the path to the front steps, made his way across the porch, and opened the door an inch. Then he paused, tilting his head Alicia thing, needing to be among your own kind, because you have that with me, Otis. I'm a vampire too. I really feel better when you're around. You are completely right on all counts, but something dark flickered in his eyes, crushing Vlad's hopes before they could even bloom. Vlad opened his mouth and closed it again, not daring to ask what that flicker meant. Otis wet his lips, his expression troubled, sorrowful, but certain. Even so, I cannot stay. Please, Vladimir, I need you to trust me on this. My staying here may endanger you and Nellie. A panicky feeling had wormed its way into Vlad's chest. He couldn't explain it, but the idea of Otis leaving him again, especially after all that he'd been through with Joss taking him last year and Diablo hinting that he wasn't finished with Vlad, made his stomach twist and turn. Frustrated, Vlad threw his hands in the air. Can't someone else look for that ritual? Otis raised his voice suddenly. Who? There is no one but me, and Ficus, of course, but his time is stretched. Vlad knew he was pushing his uncle, but it was all he had left to cling to. In but a few hours, Otis would be gone again. Vlad wasn't sure just how much more of this he could take. Isn't there a glyph or something we can place to protect all of us, or to keep the council from finding you? Otis shook his head, his tone calm. His tone calm once again. It's not as simple as that. I can hide from one, maybe two vampires utilizing glyphs, but hiding from all of Alicia is a fool's errand. Vlad's jaw tensed. He fell silent, and stood very still for a moment before speaking. My dad managed well enough. Otis closed his eyes in defeat. Well, we can't all be as crafty as your father, can we? Vlad winced. I just wish. I know. Believe me, I know. Otis turned away from him and gazed out the window near the front door, his shoulders slumped. In Vlad's mind, he heard Otis say, more than anything, I wish I could stay too. Vlad's face dropped. He had expected defeat when he'd entered this battle, but the taste of it was still bitter. Do you need help packing? Why don't we save that for after dinner? Otis smiled weakly over his shoulder at Vlad. I want to try my hand at cooking. I believe Nellie would like that. I have no taste for human food anymore, but in my previous life, I was quite the chef. Vlad shook his mind. I'll just nuke some O positive if you don't mind. Actually, I'd prefer if you dine with us. Otis turned to face him with a curious grin. I'm making blood sausage. A half hour later, the kitchen was an enormous mess. Otis had several pans and a variety of bowls out. Out on the counter, only a few of them in use. The smell of blood filled Vlad's nostrils, dizzying him with hunger pangs. Pangs. It took every ounce of his willpower to keep from lifting the big bowl of blood from the counter and slurping down every last drop. Vlad picked up the wooden spoon and stirred the spiced crimson before turning to his uncle. You know, I might as well have a bag or two of blood. As good as this might smell, animal blood doesn't do much for me in the way of vitamins and minerals. Not surprising. Most vampires find animal blood less than enjoyable to the palate and not helpful in the least when it comes to nutrients. But you needn't worry. I'm making our blood sausages from human blood. Vlad shifted uncomfortably. Otis hurried to add, and with the argument we had this morning in mind, I'm using blood from the freezer, and with as much as I'm using, Nellie will need to stock up again. They exchanged smiles before Otis scooped up bits of diced onion and dropped them in the bowl. He rinsed his hands in the sink, and as he reached for the towel, he quipped, unless, of course, you're interested in trying fresh blood. Vlad knew his uncle was joking, but still he flinched. Doesn't it bother you that you're hurting people when you feed from the source? Otis smiled. About as much as it bothers you that you're hurting plastic bags, Vladimir, he said, his tone teasing. Don't think of them as people. Think of them as assistants. Is Nellie assistance? It was a low blow, but Vlad was still hurting from his uncle's pains to leave him. From his uncle's plans to leave him. Again. rotten lip for a moment, troubled somewhat by Nellie's reaction. Even after all this time, Nellie still worried she'd come home to find him acting like some sort of animal. She'd never voiced it, but Vlad knew that was how she must feel. After all, it had to be hard for her to live with a vampire all these years. It would be like being a pizza living with Henry for an extended period of time. Say, 10 minutes or so. The thought made Vlad a little sick to his stomach. Otis took Nellie's hands in his and said, "I would never bring the fruits of my hunts into your home, Nellie. You never have to worry about that. And your ward is rather like a vegetarian, so there's no cause for alarm there either. We were simply making blood sausage for dinner." Nellie's eyes lit up. "You're cooking." Otis's voice became softer, sweeter. "It's the least I could do." Vlad almost retched at their flirting. It was the only obnoxious thing about Otis staying with them. He slipped his soiled shirt over his head and headed for the stairs, muttering that he needed to change. Not that he thought they'd hear him. He still wasn't sure how he felt about the obvious attraction between Nellie and Otis. On one hand, if they ended up married, he'd have the coolest family on the block. But on the other, the idea of them dating was kind of weird. Plus, the thought of walking in on them making out was positively repulsive. After slipping upstairs to his room and changing his shirt, Vlad took his time rejoining them for dinner. Otis cooked Nellie's blood sausages and served them with a side of spiced potatoes and buttered asparagus. Vlad's and Otis's, much to Vlad's delight, were served raw. Vlad lifted one up to his mouth and bit into it, his fangs popping through the fleshy casing. The feeling gave him an excited chill, but he said nothing to Otis about it. Even so, his uncle smiled at him as if to say, "See how pleasant it would be to suck the life out of people." After Vlad had drained 3 sausages, he sat back in his seat, surprisingly satisfied. Nellie smiled at him. "I'll take care of the dishes. Why don't you help Otis get ready?" Vlad nodded and slowly turned his eyes to Otis, who had finished his meal some time before and was watching Nellie with a sad expression. Without hesitation, Vlad spoke to his uncle telepathically. "You're going to miss her so much. I can see it in your eyes. Stay, Otis, please." But Otis wouldn't hear it. Vlad felt a definite crunch in his head, a signal that Otis had cut him off. Vlad pursed his lips. Otis stood and pulled a watch from his pocket, noting the time. "Thank you, Nellie. It would be nice to spend a moment alone with Vladimir before I leave." Vlad and Otis wordlessly carried Otis's suitcase upstairs. Otis unzipped the largest suitcase, opened the large bottom drawer of the antique bureau Nellie kept in the corner of the library, and began moving neat stacks of his clothing from the drawer to his luggage. Vlad turned away, unable to watch his uncle choose to leave him and Nellie behind. Otis's voice sounded raspy. "Would you mind gathering my toiletries together? They go in the smallest bag." Vlad grabbed the bag and walked into the bathroom. He took his time filling it, not that he was concerned with neatness or that Otis might fret over leaving his toothbrush behind. He just knew what was coming. It was goodbye, and he really, really didn't want to face it again. Every time Otis had left him behind, Vlad found it harder to be without him. Not to mention the fact that whenever Otis wasn't around, people tried to kill him. As he slipped Otis's shampoo into the bag and zipped it closed, slowly his uncle appeared in the doorway, a meek smile affixed to his lips. "All set out here." Vlad handed him the toiletries bag, and Otis led him back out into the library. Once they were there, his uncle stopped, looking very much like he wanted to tell Vlad something, but he couldn't seem to find the words. After a long silence, he said, "Trust only yourself in this world, Vladimir." Vlad blinked, uncertain His heart rammed against his ribs in a flying panic, but Vlad didn't dare scream. He couldn't endanger Nellie by drawing her into his room with a strange vampire. His breaths came out in rapid puffs, as if the air had suddenly chilled, and that's when gloved hands clamped slowly onto his shoulders. Vlad froze, speechless. The vampire, whoever it might be, was right behind him. Vladimir Tod, how I have been looking forward to seeing you again. Vlad knew that voice. It was cold, cruel, and in every nightmare he had since the end of his 8th grade year. Diablo. Chapter 5. An Unexpected Visitor. Vlad turned to face the intruder, the vampire responsible for so much of his pain and terror over the past 2 years, and said his job as best as he could. His heart slammed against his ribs in solid, terrified beats. He was screaming on the inside, but his lips remained totally silent as he defiantly stared Diablo down, his left eyebrow starkly raised as if the vampire's intrusion had only been a minor surprise. Vlad didn't speak, didn't even try, because he knew if he opened his mouth, his screams would find their way up and out into the world. Instead, he pretended that he wasn't scared out of his mind and scanned the room with his peripheral vision for anything that could be used as a weapon. The corners of Diablo's thin lips curled up in a smile. He held his hands outward as if to show that he was unarmed, but he was always armed with his fangs and vampiric strength, something Vlad's ribs refused to forget after their encounter in his 8th grade year. Of course, if Diablo was always armed, so was Vlad, but Vlad wasn't exactly comforted by that knowledge. Diablo's smile eased. I'll dispense with the pleasantries. After all, it's ridiculously apparent that we share distaste for each other. Vlad snorted. Distaste. That was a good one. Nice and understated. You have something that I want. Diablo regarded him for a moment, as if waiting for him to ask them what. Then, seeing that Vlad had no intention of speaking, he continued. Thomas's journal. At this, Vlad's other eyebrow rose in surprise. My dad's journal. Then a crease formed on his forehead as his eyebrows fell. Why? What do you want for it? Sentimental reasons. A small memento is all. Diablo tightened his gloves on his hands. The air between them grew thick with tension. Vlad shook his head slowly. No way. You can't have it. Diablo didn't look surprised at all. In fact, it looked like that was the reply he'd been expecting. You may not be aware of this fact, but Thomas and I were extremely close before he abandoned all of Elysia for the likes of you. I respected him, revered him, even. And now that he has died, an act that is so rare for a vampire to undergo, I find myself missing my old friend more than I had anticipated. Diablo's expression changed then, but only slightly. A brief blip of honest pain crossed his eyes. Seeing it made Vlad take a step back. Diablo took a step closer. You have hundreds of items to remember Thomas by. Give me this. Give me his journal. Vlad chewed his bottom lip thoughtfully. On one hand, he had the feeling that Diablo might be giving him a chunk of heartfelt truth, something that freaked him out completely. On the other, if he handed the journal over, something in his gut said that it was a trick and that he'd been paying for it in one horrible way or another. After all, Diablo was probably the biggest jerk Vlad knew, vampire otherwise, so why trust him? I know you and Thomas were close, actually, Vlad said. He was even your vice president, as I heard it. Your right-hand man on the Stokerton Council. I'm sure you two must have been close. We were. Of course, that makes it even more twisted that you tried to kill me. Twice now, isn't it? He looked at Diablo, whose expression changed dramatically at the jibe. It was almost as if this fact had never occurred to him. He looked somewhat pained. For a moment, Vlad pitied him. He shook his head again. Not the journal. You can take something to remember him by, but not that. Diablo grew quiet, and Vlad really didn't think he was mulling over what else of Thomas' belongings he might be interested in taking back with him to his office in Stokerton. features tensed, his hands, gloved in their usual shiny black leather, tightened into fists and then loosened again. When he spoke, his words were hushed and crisp. "Is there no way that I can persuade you?" Vlad felt himself relaxing a bit. It couldn't be mind control that was easing his muscular tension. Otis had taught him well not only to detect such attempts, but also how to block them. And it certainly couldn't be confidence, as he was freaking out on the inside, and it was all he could do not to run screaming into the night. Whatever it was, Vlad didn't trust it. He met Diablo's eyes with a cold gaze. "Why are you trying to persuade me at all? Why don't you just attack me and torture me until I tell you where it is? What's with this bizarre attempt at decency?" And there it was, in Diablo's cold, steel-gray eyes. Vlad didn't need telepathy to see it or understand it. Not that Diablo would allow him even a glimpse of his twisted mind, Vlad was certain. But he could see it. The reason that Diablo was talking to him instead of attacking him on sight. He really believed that Vlad was the Brabus, and part of him, small as it might be, was afraid of that. And it looked like Diablo hadn't yet figured out a way to take Vlad's life because of that fact. After all, his attempts at both ripping Vlad to shreds and trying to turn him into a walking shish kebab via wooden stake had failed miserably. Vlad straightened his shoulders, releasing the lungful of breath he'd been holding. "Tell me why you want it, exactly." An impatient light flashed across Diablo's eyes. Poised on his tongue was a blatant lie, simply to remember him by. Vlad knew better. If Diablo wanted the journal, there was a solid reason for it, one that wasn't merely sentimental. "And if I offered you some pictures or a few of his favorite books?" Diablo shook his head, a wave of low laughter escaping him. He'd grown tired of his game. In a blink, he was inches in front of Vlad, squeezing his leather-covered hand lightly around Vlad's throat, until Vlad could feel his lungs tighten in panic. Vlad tore at Diablo's hands, but his attacker held fast, whispering bluntly into his ear. "The journal or your life, boy. I'll give you some time to think it over." Then, just as suddenly as he'd attacked, Diablo released his grip and turned toward the door. Vlad coughed and gasped as air entered his lungs once again. Diablo's hand was on the knob when he managed to choke out, "That's not going to be easy if the Bravas can't be killed." Diablo smirked and opened the door. He met Vlad's eyes and shook his head. "That's not what I meant, but you'll see soon." Vlad blinked, utterly confused. He reached out with his mind, calling to Otis for help, but Otis was silent. As Diablo stepped outside, he spoke again, this time without looking back. "Sweet dreams." His words were followed by chilling laughter. Chapter 6. In Anticipation of Blood. Ignatius slipped the curved blade into the leather holster on his leg. It wasn't the only tool he would need in torturing the Tod boy, but it was by far his favorite. The blade was an extension of himself,